So JMU has multiple groups of language learners. English Language Learner Services supports anyone who has English as an other language. So that might mean a visa holding student who's here on exchange just for 1 year or 1 semester, might be a student who's here for 4 years or for a graduate program. It could be a student who is here on a short-term exchange, maybe for just a few weeks, depending on what their program is that they're involved with at their home university. So those are our visa-holding students who also do a lot with the Office of International Programs. They come through them for their visa status. Then there are students on campus who are domestic students, who are citizens, residents, have lived here all their lives, moved here in middle school, high school from another country, who then come to JMU as fully matriculated students and have all kinds of, totally similar experiences to every other student, and then they have multiple languages. So my office also supports them with just the academic piece about language, I guess, when they're in classes. There's a third group on campus also called Study Group, and that is an affiliate program that sits in Memorial Hall primarily, but is also around campus, and they bring students in who are not able to fully matriculate just yet because of their language, but everything else is on course for JMU. So they've graduated from high school successfully, they have the right kind of transcript, the right kind of grades. They will come to study group and spend anywhere from 1 to 4 semesters taking classes that are language classes, but also JMU classes that are offered through study group. So faculty from JMU or adjunct faculty from JMU may be employed separately by study group, and then they're teaching those students content from JMU classes, but with a focus on language acquisition, so that they are prepared when they come into the university, and they enter the university with credits from the JMU courses they've taken, but not a GPA. So they're treated as a transfer in that regard. And then those students tend to matriculate into JMU. They do use the language services as well as the rest of the learning centers while they're in study group. So it is good to know that you might have students who are actively developing their language proficiency, and they're also JMU students, but they're not necessarily your fully matriculated visa holding student or your domestic student who maybe went to high school or even middle school and high school in the United States. So English language learning writers typically face challenges that range anywhere from cultural understanding to the mechanics of how the paper is supposed to look, down to like font size and things like that, which is also something that freshmen struggle with occasionally, just in general at JMU, arriving and discovering, oh, it's got to be 12-point font, it's got to have certain margins and things like that. But that's something that sort of gets hashed out within the first year for most students. For English language learners, especially as they progress into their disciplinary language, there tends to be a little bit more of a need to be able to understand why a student is particularly writing a certain way, like maybe they're using lots of details, or maybe they're not really using any details, and it might actually be a cultural question a little bit more than knowing how to write those details. Sometimes vocabulary is an issue, just that the student doesn't have the same bank of vocabulary to choose from in English, but they might have a greater vocabulary in their home language than we even have in English, but it's a matter of finding a way to help the students know the language that they can use, and so supplying vocabulary is something that is really useful with English language learners and slightly pedagogically different from a writing center, where writing center pedagogy is more that you ask questions and you sort of help the student discover what the answer is. Sometimes with language learners, it's almost mean because they don't have the word, and so if you're asking them to come up with a different word for analysis, it might be really frustrating because they just don't have another word in English. And so supplying words is something that, that is really helpful when working with a language learner when it comes to vocabulary. Obviously there's a balance. You don't want to overdo it, but you also don't want to underdo it and really frustrate yourself and the student when you're working with them. So culture, vocabulary, I know that we attempt to steer away from formulaic writing, but we do have academic expectations for writing that are culturally based. And so when an English language learner is writing in a different format, there may be some confusion over like why you would put a thesis in a certain place, or Perhaps there's a difference between how direct you are in one culture to another culture. That's very common among our international students from different places who have gone through, maybe even some college in another culture, another country, or maybe even multiple cultures and countries, and then they're suddenly in the United States and they have to understand what's expected of them here. I encourage students a lot to talk with their faculty when they have assignments, to look at the assignments with the faculty, to try to get feedback that's really helpful for that particular professor, because as everyone here knows, every faculty member has a different set of criteria. The rubrics don't look the same. There might not even be a rubric, and so it just matters that the student feels like they're being supported in this particular course and they understand that the next class they can use this new knowledge that they've gained, but it might not be the same expectations. And that is challenging for some people who come in from different places where the standards are more consistent than they really are in the US. And of course, there's a difference between someone who just wants to develop as a writer and be a stronger writer in English in general, and someone who just really needs to get through this course. This is the last writing heavy class they have, and they're just like desperate to get through it. They're going to require a different sort of support and help. The first thing is to try to relax. I know that that might sound silly to say when you're comfortably sitting in your home or wherever you are taking this class, but when you're actually faced with someone that you feel like maybe you're not as competent to support, you tend to get a little anxiety there. And so often students will feel a sense of fear, and then that will actually impact their ability to listen and to really try to support the student. I really try to encourage sort of like connection, and that seems to help everyone feel more comfortable. So the first tip would be just relax and realize that you're going to be, if you can listen to the student, hear what they have to say, and give them, the sort of the respect that they're expecting, and that will really make them feel more appropriately served, then that's a successful way to begin. So I would definitely suggest, I know you guys do breathing exercises in class and things like that. I don't know if you're doing it in the online version of the course, but there's a lot that the Writing Center offers to support you in like how to kind of get zoned in and relaxed to what you're doing. Another tip I would have would be to honor what the student's asking for. If the student comes in and says that they really just need help with grammar, understand that you can use grammar as sort of a basis to work on some of the larger issues, or maybe not larger issues, but some of the higher order issues that I know that you're really interested in working on as a Writing Center tutor. So to be aware that you can use what the student's asking for to actually serve multiple purposes. And of course, that's kind of an art, and it definitely takes some practice. So I would encourage you to maybe get a little bit familiar with grammar. Sometimes our international students who are visa holding might have a much stronger understanding of English grammar than your typical native English-speaking domestic student does, because often we haven't studied our own language explicitly very much through the school system in the United States. And so sometimes it may be a little intimidating when the student says, but isn't that a relative clause? And you're thinking like, oh my God, what's a relative clause? So it is helpful to kind of brush up a little bit. And there are some books in the Writing Center when you're tutoring that you can rely on to just like glance through and spend some time with. And I guess I'm encouraging you to do this on your own sort of downtime around sessions. But I've also seen students use them successfully in sessions. I think it just depends on how comfortable you are using the resources, and it's always good to have a little bit of an understanding of just like basic language structure so that you can use that meta language. Of course, that's also not to set you up and say all students who have English as a second or other language know how to talk about language using the sort of meta language terms. A lot of students also just learn English through being in a school system that taught them English or even used English as the medium for instruction. And they don't necessarily have that language awareness. So you can't always assume that that's true, but it is awfully helpful to have, especially for visa holding students. So that is, I guess, the second or third thing. I'm not sure where I am in the numbering of things that you could do to support English language learners who are looking for help with writing. Another thing that I think is useful would be to ask questions with the understanding that they might need more time to answer you. So if you ask like, what do you think, I don't know, what do you think this is about? Give it a moment. Like, don't just like, if they don't answer instantly, like there needs to be a little bit of processing time, especially if a student's coming in working on something that is like very outside of their cultural understanding. Like for example, sometimes a student will be in a literature course. It's being taught from a Western perspective with a lot of assumptions about what people are coming in with. And so what's symbolic to a Western person might not be symbolic to someone coming from an Eastern, mindset. So that becomes a real interesting kind of place for a tutor to recognize that there's more happening here than just, what do you think this is about? And then the student saying like, I don't know, a man and his dog, like there's more to it than that. So I think just giving a little bit of processing time is really helpful as well. Something, I guess, disciplinarily speaking, that would be helpful would be when you have students that come in and want to completely revise something, or they want to get through like all of their 5-page paper and they want you to go through it with a fine-tooth comb. That's not always possible, and that that's possible. That's not necessarily possible for the way that you approach writing, but the student might feel like very disappointed that you aren't able to kind of get through all of that. And I think it's really helpful to set expectations at the beginning so that you and the student both can understand like, okay, I'm definitely going to look at grammar with you, but we might not be able to get through the whole paper, and that's okay because I'm going to show you some things that you can do. You can also make, another appointment this week, or you can go see Kristen if you really want to talk about language learning or grammar, because I love grammar, so that's good to know. So English Language Learner Services, send your grammar questions here. But yeah, that's something just to be aware of, that it might be helpful to set some expectations at the beginning and then to check in with them as you move through the session. If you've got 45 minutes and you spend the first 5 minutes doing something the students specifically said they needed, then you start to deviate into something else that you notice. It might be good to check it back in and say like, I've noticed that you did want grammar and we're working on that, but I'm also really seeing here that there's some confusion, and I want to talk about, just drilling down a little bit more so that we can, is that okay? And then like see where the student, oh, I didn't realize that, and then you can take it in a new direction. But I think that there's a respect to that that students really appreciate. And I guess I can't really give you too much disciplinarily because we serve all disciplines. That's something else to keep in mind. Language learners, they're going to come in for writing with from any background, and I know that that's typically true of your average writing center client, but it is important to note that language learners are not just relegated to one space. You're not going to get a bunch of students that come in and they're writing the same paper because they're taking the same class. So there's going to be the potential that any student that you serve will have English as another language, and it'll potentially be like a science paper, or something that maybe you should just be aware could come from any direction. I guess is helpful to know. This is a tricky question because should sort of implies that there's one way to do it, and I know that pedagogically, I've mentioned this before, the Writing Center operates a little differently than English Language Learner Services. So what I can do is give you an idea of what typically happens in a Writing Center and what I do that's a little bit different, so that you can kind of start thinking about referrals and how you would encourage a student to use both services. And it's probably important to note that a student can use both places successfully on the same paper. So it's not that you graduate from one into the next, or that you work with the Writing Center until you hit a wall and then you have to come to ELLS. It's possible to use both on the same paper, and some students do. Obviously that's time consuming and that requires students to make appointments, and there's a lot of coordination that happens there, but it is worth encouraging students to do. So grammar. I mentioned before that it's good to know some grammar yourself, so perhaps familiarizing yourself with the basic structure of a sentence, the basic parts of speech, figuring out how you might explain some of the trickier stuff. One of the things I consistently hear from Writing Center tutors who do talk with me about grammar is that they're really keen to support the student. They understand with language learners it's important to actually focus on grammar when they're asking for grammar. But there becomes this moment when the student asks a tricky grammar question and they're like, I don't know, it just is that way. And I think that that's a difficult place to be, because that there's a reason that it's that way, but you don't know what the reason is. And then the student's sort of looking to you as the native language expert. And I think that there's some sense of responsibility there to give them a good response. So I want to encourage you to realize it's okay to say, like, I don't actually know the reason for that, but I can certainly look it up. And, you know, if you have access to the resource that's available to you, if you're in the Writing Center, then you can grab a book off the shelf and you can try to look it up. That is obviously time consuming. It might take away from the greater purpose. You could also say, this is a great question and I'm going to write it down and I'm going to ask someone so I'll be better prepared the next time. But if you'd like to know, certainly the person you can talk to, like right now in this moment, and then look around. If you see someone who knows grammar well, connect them with that person. If not, refer them to me. Say, we have a grammar person who loves grammar and she's actually a language expert. And if you wanted to go talk to her, her name's Kristen, she's right down the hall. And I'm sure you're going to ask me about referrals in a minute, but it's helpful to kind of start getting familiar and comfortable with the language of how to encourage a student to use my services as well. So what I do with grammar is I talk about it and I get into it with them and I look at the sentences that they're struggling with and I notice initially, like, is this something that's common? Is it repeated? Is it a habit? Is it something they don't know yet or they haven't mastered? Is it something they're doing wrong? Is it something that, when I say wrong, I mean like consistently wrong, so that they've almost like learned a rule that isn't actually serving them? Or are they in fact just completely unaware that this is something that they need to do? If you're dealing with prepositions and articles, be aware that that is common for English language learners who have like PhDs in English literature that are from other cultures. So it's just the highest levels of proficiency to native-like speech. That's the distinguishing piece, is prepositions and articles. They're tough to know when to apply. They're tough to know when not to apply. There's a lot of exceptions. So don't get too caught up in articles and prepositions. And it's really helpful if before you actually start working with language learners, you can start reading ELL writing to get an idea of what it looks like to read something that has misapplied prepositions or misused articles, because it's really disconcerting. I think as native readers, we become so accustomed to seeing these things in the right places that when they're off, we tend to think the whole idea is wrong, or we tend to sort of react really aggressively when in fact it's just a word that's off. And, you know, sometimes we take it literally and we think like, well, he said on the table, but, you know, did he mean on the table or under the table or near the table or around the table? And I think that is probably one of the trickiest things for someone who's just starting to work with English language learner writing to understand, is that just because there's some small mistakes doesn't actually mean that the content or that the bigger picture is actually wrong. It just means that there's some issues with prepositions, and there's probably going to be for a long time. So I guess what I'm encouraging you to do is not get hung up on prepositions and articles. If it really upsets you, supply them. Let the student know this isn't the word that we use here. You probably won't be able to explain why. Maybe you will. That's great. But I don't think there's anything wrong with supplying a preposition or an article with maybe a mini, like, and this is why we put this here. But I like to ask students, can you explain why we say the United States of America, but we just say America? Most native English speakers can't explain that. So that's your task. I want you to go figure out how to do that. See if you can find why we put a the in front of United States, but not in front of America. Okay, so moving on. And Laura can check that later. So moving on, I think that it would be useful for us to also talk a little bit about maybe what happens with how I use grammar to look at higher order thinking. So because sentence structure is indicative of an actor and an action, and then possibly some other information, it's useful if you get confused in someone's sentence to say like, okay, so tell me just like who's doing the action. And then you can maybe figure out a little bit more clearly what's happening in the sentence. Or tell me, you know, what is the actual action that's happening here? What's intended to happen? And you can use grammar to start to look at bigger questions of comprehensibility and really evoking ideas. One of the most useful tools that I have is a very simple one. It's simply asking the student, tell me what you mean here. Just tell me what you mean here. And often they can say it much more clearly than it's written. And this is true of native speakers as well. You know, we start to get in our heads and we write all kinds of very intelligent things. And then when someone says, what does this mean? Say it in more simple language and it's actually much clearer. And I think that's incredibly useful. So I would definitely encourage you to use that when talking grammar or just, you know, stuff in general. You don't have to be super nervous. These are students, they're JMU students, so you have that in common. You can always, you know, go Dukes it, and like everyone will feel more comfortable. I think that it's useful to keep in mind that when you feel uncomfortable, it's because you feel some kind of insecurity somewhere probably. And so if you could just maybe even jot down for yourself like what it is that's making you feel uncomfortable, like, oh, they asked a question, I didn't know how to answer it, it was a grammar question. So you note to self, I should do some professional development around grammar. Or, they came in and I had a really hard time understanding them. It takes time to learn how to listen to someone with an accent. And so being aware of that, maybe start putting yourself in places where you can start to listen to people with accents more often, whether it's, watching films that have, people with heavy accents in them, or whether it's just exposing yourself to more people that are from different cultures. That might sound kind of elementary, but I think it's actually really useful because at this point I've been doing this for like over 10 years and I'm excellent at deciphering what people are saying out of accents, and it surprises me a little bit when I realize that sometimes people around me just like have no idea what was said. And it's interesting because I realized it's a skill. It's something I've developed. I didn't start out knowing how to understand people. It's just over time you start listening for more important pieces, or you can pick up the pattern to the accent more quickly. So as far as being afraid of an accent, expose yourself a little bit more. It's okay to say, I'm following you to a point, but then I'm having a little trouble getting this last part. Could you just like say it to me again in a different way? And then you're not stopping them every 20 seconds saying, what? Because that's frustrating for you and for the student that you're working with. And be aware that they have the same goal you do, and that's to upgrade their paper. They want to successfully upgrade their paper. And so just like any tutorial that you're participating in, it's good to kind of always go back to like, how are we making this paper better versus like how uncomfortable am I right now, or or even going in another direction and feeling like you're a tour guide at JMU. You don't have to do that either. These are JMU students. Sometimes a student might ask about other resources around campus. That's true of any student, and so it's good to know what else is available. It's also really good to know what is happening in the learning centers. We have a calendar when you first walk in to the side of the learning centers that isn't math and science basically, and familiarize yourself with it. Glance up and say like, oh, there's a couple of programs in English Language Learner Services, communication centers offering this special thing about resumes or whatever, so that you can actually help direct students in the learning centers. I think that's a really useful tool. And certainly, wherever you're working, if you're working with language learners or if you're working with just people in general, it's always good to kind of like have a lay of the land so that you can be as helpful and supportive as possible. So English Language Learner Services provides a few different arenas of assistance. We have one-on-one tutoring, which I call consultations, and there's different lengths of those, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and 45 minutes. And so students can kind of self-select like, oh, I've just got a quick question, so I need 15 minutes, or I have an assignment that I'm getting started and I just want to quickly kind of go over like what it means and how to get going, and so maybe a planning session would be 20 minutes. 30 minutes I call an academic skills consultation. That's when somebody wants to like be better at vocabulary, so we're going to spend 30 minutes like really focusing on disciplinary vocabulary for whatever it is that they're needing. And then a 45-minute full session is typically where people bring their papers to me that are in progress, in a draft form, or even like toward the end where they're really just wanting to like hone it. That is what a consultation is, and sometimes I have student tutors and sometimes it's just me tutoring. I also offer out of the office a couple of different programs. So I've noticed over the years that we have students who really want to develop as writers in English, and they come in at all different levels of proficiency, all different backgrounds, all different visa status, like everything it's pretty wide open as far as who joins this particular group. But it's called the Multilingual Writers Community, and it meets 2 hours every week during school. And what we do is write together. So we get together and we just sort of chit-chat about like what's going on in our lives, what's happening in the news, and then we'll choose something to write about, or students can bring in assignments that they want to work on, and we'll spend about 45 minutes to an hour actually writing in the same space together, just sort of a supported space. I'm there, so I can offer professional assistance if someone has a question, but also their peers are there in case they want to ask a question about something that, maybe I, as like a professional, don't have an answer to because I don't like live in Huffman or whatever. So it's helpful to have that as well. Then at the end of that, what we do is spend about 20 minutes. Students can choose to read what they've written and share it with everyone, and they get to ask what kind of feedback they want, So if they want, I'm working on Just comprehensibility. I'm having trouble with people really understanding what I'm writing. Can you guys let me know if this is comprehensible? Then we do. So that's kind of a neat space, and usually it's the same group of students every week, but you're welcome to come anytime. Certainly refer students who are interested. We have had a few native English speakers come over time. They're typically looking for writing groups, and this isn't exactly a writing group where we like workshop each other's stuff, but the goal here is just to develop fluency and accuracy and proficiency and confidence in writing in English, and most of the time it's academic English. So that's one program that's offered weekly. Another program is called English Conversation Club, and a JMU student facilitates this, and it's about an hour a week. And again, it's a different group of students usually than those that are coming to MWC. Sometimes there's some overlap. This group usually meets in the evenings. MWC usually meets like during business hours since I run it. And then the other programs happen in the evening typically because it's more accessible for our student population. But the English Conversation Club is a focus on developing facility with just speaking in English. So if someone, for example, is in classes and they're in small groups and they're finding it just like a little bit intimidating or challenging to jump in when they're having to talk with these American English speakers, then this would be a great opportunity for them to come and just practice talking. So it's a low stress environment, low pressure. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. You can ask any questions that you have. We've discovered that this is a really popular group. It almost has like a following. So, every semester there's like a slightly different group, but we always have core people that come back. And one of the reasons is because they just build more confidence and more capacity with the language so that when they are in an academic setting, there's more confidence to ask questions. They feel more confident going and talking to faculty members. They feel more confident in groups. So the goal is just to offer a space for students to practice conversing in English, maybe around academic topics, maybe around cultural stuff. It just really depends on the flavor du jour. It just, it depends on what happens that week or in that session. In spring semester, we always have a lot of cultural stuff happening because you've got, the Super Bowl and things that are not necessarily widely known in the world. And so suddenly there's all this stuff happening on campus that students want to know about. Mardi Gras, things that, are not like maybe some of the most commonly known things around the world. So that happens a lot during the spring. But that's once a week, and that is to develop just fluency and accuracy with speaking. And then another program that we offer occasionally is called Grammar Hour, which is exactly what it sounds like. We do an hour of grammar, and a student facilitates that, and it typically is designed to just support students who are explicitly looking to upgrade their grammar. Oftentimes, these are not our visa-holding students. This is often domestic students who have entered the United States between probably like 6th grade and 12th grade, and maybe learned a lot by acquisition. And so they were in spaces where they were using English, they were in classes where they were using English, social spaces, but they weren't necessarily explicitly taught a lot of the grammar. So when they acquired it versus learned it, there's like this piece missing, and sometimes those students find it really helpful to come to Grammar Hour. Grammar Hour is a little bit by demand, so it might not always be offered, but if you have a student who's interested in some kind of grammar, anything, you can always refer them to an appointment, and then I will note, oh, this person's interested in grammar, and perhaps we can get a group going. So right now, that's pretty much what we're offering. We also have been a site for research. We have a master's in teaching English as a second language here at JMU, and we've had a student come in and do her thesis research using our area and created a digital storytelling workshop that she did. So there's lots of different uses, lots of different ways that we provide services for students on campus. We also serve faculty and staff on campus who are multilingual. And even most recently, as like last semester, I think we worked with a wife of a visiting scholar. So there's lots of opportunity for people to plug in, and we're always happy to, when we have the resources, to support whatever's out there. I guess I should say too, we work on writing, reading, listening, speaking, and grammar. I also can advocate for students for test taking accommodations because language is a proficiency and not under the Americans with Disabilities Act. When students might need more processing time, for example, on an exam, whether it's an essay test or if it's a multiple choice test, They're oftentimes sent to the Disability Services Office to receive a letter of accommodation, but they don't provide that under the ADA, so then they get referred to me. So if a student is struggling with processing time on a test, that's something else that I can advocate for them on their behalf. And that is a little different from the Writing Center, that I do advocacy directly to faculty and for students, and also to student affairs for them as well. So I think that pretty much covers what ELLS does. Tutors are welcome to refer students to me when there is a language concern that the tutor has that the tutor doesn't know how to address. It's also fine to do if the student's expressing interest in, I really wish I could develop my English, or, oh, I need to work on my English, or something like that, then that's a great moment to say, we have a language specialist. And I think that that language is really helpful to use, language specialist, because then you're not necessarily calling anyone out and saying, oh yeah, your English sucks, you need to go to English Language Learner Services. Like, you never want to be, demeaning about the situation. You always want to sort of look at it in a positive light, that we have a language specialist, we have an office that deals directly with how to upgrade language for writing. This is the website that you can go to. She's right around the corner. You can physically get up and walk someone over if you wanted to. I typically encourage students to just kind of, if they notice someone has English as a second language because the person has said it, or they have written about it, or they have language learner issues in their paper, it's never a good idea, obviously, to just like look at someone and go like, oh, I think that's an English language learner. Like, I think it's more important to actually find out sort of organically through what you're doing, and then you could certainly refer them to my office. But a lot of times I do referrals back to the Writing Center as well, where students will come to me thinking that what they need is language help, and they really just need writing support. And since I offer support, language support on papers, and I encourage students to use both services, side by side, I'm pretty clear that I'm not directly supporting writing. So I'm not necessarily going to be talking about the writing things that would happen in a writing session, and I try to help students see that there's benefit to both types of service, and you can do the same thing. You can encourage students who want to focus on language, or who you see could really benefit from focusing on language. We have a language specialist, and she offers all kinds of programs, and it doesn't take away from your 2 times a week cap for the Writing Center. I think that's also helpful, because sometimes students want to make sure that they can get the help they need for writing, and they don't want to dilute it, and so that's useful too.